вами сам особисто познайомитися, це колосально. Дякую. Thank you for introducing yourself personally to each of the participants. Доктор МакКарті, власне, є доктором богослов'я і закінчив богословську школу в Каліфорнії. Є автором численних монографій, статей. Я отут гортала. Колосальний шмат роботи, власне, пороблений доктором МакКарті. І що найцікавіше для мене, як біблістки, що доктор МакКарті вміє поєднувати академічне богослов'я із сучасними викликами тої чи іншої країни. І країни, в яких викладав доктор МакКарті: Афганістан, Австралія, Об'єднані Арабські Емірати, В'єтнам, Росія, Литва, Китай, Чехія, Нігерія, щоб тільки сказати кілька. Найближча країна, власне, в якій нещодавно також викладав доктор МакКарті, це є Литва у Вільнюсі. Зараз доктор МакКарті гостює в Дні.
I am a lecturer at different universities right now.
But here in Ukraine right now, where are you?
I don't live here now.
No, I know, but you're lecturing right now.
Oh, tomorrow I'm lecturing this week in Dnipro.
Дніпро. Власне, зараз професор МакКарті проводить лекції на сході України, в центральній Україні, на Дніпрі, але на запрошення декана Богословського факультету приїхав прочитати 2 лекції, власне, в Українському богословському університеті. І сьогоднішня лекція для мене, як біблістки, взагалі є колосальною, бо я ніколи не думала про Біблію такими категоріями. Але коли почитала, власне, назву, я зрозуміла, наскільки Біблія є багатогранною і цікавою, і наскільки оце людське в ній є присутнє. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, good evening to all of you. I want to congratulate you because coming to a lecture at 6 o'clock means you are very brave people. Either brave or, well, we will make it interesting. Brave or brave.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased that you're here, and I've been in Ukraine many times. I first came before most of you were born. My first visit was in 1990. See, I told you. And I've lectured at universities in Kharkiv and, of course, Kiev and Dnipro and other cities, Ternopil, and so I'm glad to be here tonight. And I think you'll find it interesting because I'm a reader. I love to read. When I was a child, I grew up on a farm. My father was a farmer, and my mother was a businesswoman. So I was working on a farm. And my family teased me because I would take a book or a magazine everywhere I went. So we're sitting at the table to eat our dinner as a family, and I'm sitting there reading a book while we're eating our dinner. I love to read. I paid my way through college by teaching a speed reading course. So I taught other people how to read really fast. That's how I made my way through college. I love to read. I read every day. And so I'm going to tell you about what happens to be my favorite book. I will ask you, how is my English? Can you understand me reasonably well? Okay, let's make a deal. If I go too fast, or if I'm not speaking clearly enough, you just wave at me, or yell, or throw something, and I will slow down, because I know how frustrating it can be when you can't really follow what someone is saying. And also, if you're interested in the PowerPoint, just send me an email, and I will send it to you. So you've got my email address there. Now, with any lecture that is worthwhile, we need to have a test, don't we? And we'll start with the test, or let's call it a quiz tonight. So I'll ask you a quiz. I'm going to give you a riddle. The book I'm going to talk about tonight is the all-time best-selling book in history, year after year, since printing was invented. This book I'll talk about is the most translated book in history. It's the very first book to be printed anywhere in the world. And it happens, it played a major role in shaping the language that I'm speaking tonight, and many other languages. Now, this book got I hate to tell you, but it got a very bad reputation. A lot of people think that it is a boring book. I need to tell you, there are some parts that are boring, but most parts are really fascinating. I love stories. Don't you love stories? We all love stories. This book is the best collection of stories you will ever find. So that's my riddle. So what is your guess the book that I'll be talking about tonight? You're saying, are we total idiots? We know what book you're going to talk about. Now, I've got a couple of people back there that I can't see. But I like to see everybody I'm talking to, because otherwise you might go to sleep and I wouldn't even know it. So if you go to sleep, I can throw something at you, because it is evening. Yeah, you're right. It's the Bible. Now, I hope I can give you a fresh perspective on this book, because it presents life in its raw form. Now, a lot of books kind of clean up life, and they make life seem easy and simple. This book, the big message is simple, but the stories are definitely not simple. They're complicated. And one reason why this book is so popular is because it is so honest. You got bad people and stupid people and people that get more stupid and they do bad stuff to other people. And then some of them find hope and change. Now, it describes really what shall we say, the gritty ugliness of life. Maybe some of you came from a dysfunctional family. Toynbee said all our families are dysfunctional in their own way. But if you want to talk about a dysfunctional family, here's some examples in this book, the Bible. Brothers betraying brothers. Brothers selling brothers for a little extra spending money. Not much, just enough to buy a sandwich. Brothers killing brothers. Brothers raping their sister. You can't get much more raw than that. A daughter-in-law dressing up like a prostitute and having sex with her father-in-law. I mean, yuck, really? But she had a purpose. We've got adultery and lying about it, and the guy that's being unfaithful murdering the woman's husband, and then he goes and writes songs about God. I told you it was complicated. It's really complicated. Now, I hope to entice you to read this book. So there's plenty of dysfunctionality going around. Let's see if we can get a big overview of the book, because after all, it is long. Let me ask you first, how many of you have read something in the Bible yourself? I mean, not hearing it read, but how many of you have read anything in the Bible yourself? Okay, whoa. I've got to tell you, I have given this lecture at many universities, and I've never had such a high percentage of people say they've read it. So maybe I just need to shut up and listen to you. Let me ask this. How many of you have read through the whole Bible at least once? Oh, whoa. I am impressed. Now, you get paid to.
Yeah, you're right.
But my guess is you did before you were paid to. That's fair enough. So this book is really a lot of books. 66 different books. It can vary back and forth between Protestant and Catholic versions. It's written by about 40 authors over about a 1,500-year period, written primarily in Greek and Hebrew. And you've got it written on 3 continents. Asia, written in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Palestine, Jordan, Israel, all nations that are hot in the news these days. Africa, primarily Egypt, and Europe, primarily Cyprus, Greece, and Italy. You've got all these literary genres represented in the Bible. My wife's PhD is in second language acquisition, so she teaches philology. And so I hear about literary genres all the time. And so she made me include this, so you know it's a lot of different kinds of literature in the Bible. And amazingly, it addresses scores of really complex philosophical subjects with remarkable unity, and at the end of the day, simplicity. So it really does an amazing job. Let's look at the big picture of what it's done. I just told you it was the first book to be translated. It's the first book to be translated into multiple languages, starting first around 550 BC, what we call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. It was the first book to be printed. You've all heard about the Gutenberg Bible. Many of you have probably seen a copy of the Gutenberg Bible, 1456. As I said, it's the best-selling book in history, translated and published in more languages than any other book. Now think about this. The whole Bible is available in 469 languages. Parts of the Bible available in 2,527 languages. I bet only the philologist here knew there were that many languages. And amazingly, Bible translation efforts really gave birth to the whole academic discipline of linguistics. It was born out of Bible translation. Now, in our secular world, the Bible doesn't get a lot of credit, but there are a lot of academic disciplines that were launched through the study of the Bible. So, here's the big problem. As I mentioned, the Bible got a bad rap. It got a bad reputation as being boring, and it got a bad reputation as being a religious book. And that's too bad, because it was primarily people who were reading the book that gave it its bad reputation. And it's really too bad, because now many of you have already read it, but if we go up and down the streets, well, at least in my country, in the United States, whoa, I could go down many sidewalks, and many people have never, ever read the Bible. Nothing. They maybe heard part of it, but they haven't read it for themselves. So it got a bad reputation. So here's what I want to say, basically. The Bible was written to be read by ordinary people. The Bible is to be honored, to be sure, kissed, to be sure, but read most of all. And many people have the first two, but not the third. They're not reading it. So it's made to be read by, I think we're ordinary people. Are there any priests here tonight? No. So we're all non-priests. So we're all ordinary people, I guess we could say. And this is what this book was made for, our kind of people. And secondly, we have two of us here, I think, who are native English speakers. Anyone else for whom English is your first language? Okay. Here's my pitch. Here's my sales pitch. Reading the Bible is one of the best ways to sharpen your English skills of any other book I could recommend. And I'll make that case as we go through the evening, because the language was shaped by the Bible. In fact, a friend of mine, Alistair McGrath, he's a scholar at Oxford, he says the two greatest influences in the shaping of the English language are the works of William Shakespeare, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the English translation of the Bible that appeared in 1611. That's called the King James Version of the Bible. David Crystal is one of the great linguists of the world. My wife talks about David Crystal all the time. I'm glad he doesn't live next door. She'd probably go hug him sometime or something. She loves David. Well, she doesn't agree with a lot of what he says, because I think he is an atheist. But he has some amazing things to say about the Bible. So it's kind of an interesting twist, because he admires the Bible linguistically. And here's what Crystal says. That, well, actually, he starts his book about the Bible by quoting a guy that says, a person who professes to be a critic in the delicacies of the English language ought to have the Bible at his fingertips. And then he talks about how the Bible is a part of the English language culture. You can't understand English without understanding the Bible, at least understanding it well. So tonight, I want to ask and answer, hopefully, 3 questions. Here's where we're going. I want to ask, why has the Bible been so popular over so many centuries? Why? I can understand a book zooming to the top of the New York Times bestseller list for a while, but for not just year after year, not just decade after decade, but century after century after century. We're going on 6 centuries now it's been a bestseller. Why? Secondly, how did the Bible influence the English language so much? And then third, I want to read to you some of the most famous passages of the Bible. You all will probably have them memorized for all I know. So let's get into the first question. Why is the Bible so popular? I'm going to give you about 4 reasons why the Bible is popular. Number 1, the Bible is popular because it shaped many of the values of our Western culture. Now, let me give you some examples here. Many of these values that we consider groundwork for the Western culture were shaped out of the Bible. Human rights and social justice. In my lecture yesterday, I quoted from one of my heroes, Charles Malik, who's a Christian diplomat from Lebanon. He was the primary author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He's an Orthodox believer who loved Jesus passionately. He was the first president of the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly. And the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, much of it came right out of Charles Malik's being soaked in the Bible. And of course, the commitment. The dignity and rights of women, equality guaranteed by law, right to vote, freedom and representative government, private property. The Bible assumes. Now, your parents weren't told this by the Soviet authorities a generation ago, but the Bible assumes private property, the right of individuals and families to own property, health care and hygienic practices, development of hospitals, orphanages, helping the poor, famine relief, abolition of slavery. The modern civil rights movement in America was birthed out of a biblical faith. And then, of course, the birth of modern science came out of people who said, this world was created by an intelligent being. And since the world is predictable, that's a sign, a clear sign of an intelligent designer. And thus, you have the birth of modern science. If we had stayed with a belief in randomness, Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, science would have never been born. Because what can you predict? Why study something that may not turn out to be the same tomorrow? So the birth of modern science. Secondly, the Bible's popular, and I'm going to word it with my bias here. You don't have to agree with me, but this is my bias. Because it's providing God's answers to our biggest questions. Now, if I was in a different place, I might say because it claims to offer God's answers to the biggest questions. What are those biggest questions? Well, one is, who am I? I'm speaking on that in NEPRO later this week. Why am I here? How can I change? Who is God? That's kind of a big question. How did the universe begin? How can I find fulfillment and happiness? What is real? Is there life after death? How do I know what is right and wrong? What is the meaning of history? Life's biggest questions. Now, the next reason the Bible is so popular is one that your parents and grandparents would have understood very well. And that is, this book has had more people die for it than any other book in history. Thousands of people. It's been banned, burned, outlawed, and ripped apart century after century. And many people in this city and in this country paid the highest price they could because of their commitment to a simple proposition that this book is the Word of God. Now, I have a picture of two women here. These are two Iranian sisters who just 4 years ago were tortured and imprisoned for 2 years by the Muslim government for this horrendous sin, crime of distributing Bibles. So this is not non-existent now. So every year, there are people who have a passionate allegiance to this book that I'm talking about, who are paying the highest price with their life. So when there's a book that's that popular, that is that costly, that gets people's attention. If you know somebody gave their life because of this book, well, that merits my attention. The next reason is because it contains great literature, fascinating stories. In fact, let me just give you an example. Let me just read you a little bit of a story, because I am hoping that as a result of this evening, you will say, yeah, I want to read more of this book. So let me read you one of the more interesting stories here in the first book of the Bible. And at the end of a talk, I'll recommend that if you don't read this book much, that you start by reading the Gospel of Luke. It's very fast-moving, lots of interesting stories about people. And this first book, the book of Genesis. I want to read you about a good-looking guy named Joe. Now, his family called him Joseph. He was well-built and handsome, everything that I've never been. And after a while, his master's wife, now he was a slave, essentially. His brothers had sold him into slavery. You may know the story. For just a little bit of money. So he's been taken by the slave traders from Israel down to Egypt, about 300 miles. Not so far in our world, but it was a world away for him. So he's well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was in sight. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." Well, I'm out of time. You'll have to read the story to find out what happens. Do you see what I mean? That's a good story. And the thing about it is, it happened. This is one thing that a lot of people miss. This book is history. It's not like any religion book you'll find that's full of myth and, well, maybe this happened, maybe it didn't. It's rooted in real people, in a real space-time universe. Well, the next big question we have to answer, the second big issue we're going to talk about is, how did the Bible influence the English language? How did it happen? I want to describe to you how much it was shaped. Now here, just for a second, the two of you can go take a coffee break, because I'm repeating just a little bit of what I talked about yesterday afternoon in the lecture. Much of the Bible translation in the modern ages was sparked by the Protestant Reformation. And here's the simple logic that led to the translation of the Bible into all these languages. All of us know that the medieval Catholic Church, very much in contrast today, but the medieval Catholic Church discouraged people from reading the Bible. Positively discouraged. I mean, if you translated the Bible, they would kill you, as they did many people. So, not a really fertile ground for trying a translation into popular language of Ukrainian for the Bible. Not very wise idea for a long life. The Protestant Reformation, though, changed all that, because here's their simple logic. This book is the Word of God. God has spoken. And every person needs access to this book. It's so important. So we need two things. Number one, we need Bibles in the language of every person in the world. Every person needs to be able to read the Bible for themselves. Because it's so important. You don't want to have to go through anybody else. You need to understand it for yourself. And if that's true, then every person needs to learn how to read. Because you can't read without learning to read. I know that's deep logic, but it's there. And that's why the Protestant Reformation launched what they called universal compulsory education for boys and for girls. Because again, the medieval Catholic Church said, why should girls learn to read? There's no need for girls to learn to read. Their brain can't handle it. And plus, they can't be priests. That's the main reason you need to learn how to read. But when the Protestant Reformation said every person needs to be able to read, that changed the whole equation. And so we had compulsory education for boys and for girls. That's why then almost every major language of Europe, the first book that was translated was the Bible. So you've got the Bible influencing not just English, but German. My German friends tell me that the translation that Martin Luther did right after he refused to recant still shapes the German language today. The imprint of that earthy, real language that Luther used shapes the German language to this day. It shapes French. It shaped Russian, Italian, Dutch, Latvian. I was in Bulgaria a few months ago, and they said it shaped our language because the first book in Bulgarian was the Bible. As I mentioned, we lived in Lithuania for 5 years. My wife was a philology professor there. And so the Lithuanians said, yep, same here. First book in our Bible, in our language, was the Bible. She went to present a plenary address at a linguistics conference in Riga, Latvia. And one of the main papers was the first book in Latvian was the Bible, and that translation shaped the Latvian language. So the imprint came from this book. So expressions and phrases. Before we get to those details, I want to show you a little bit of how much it influenced the English language. British authors were influenced greatly by the Bible. So John Milton's great classics, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. After the Bible, Bunyan's book, The Pilgrim's Progress, is the most translated and published book in history. So that's another book you might put on your list to read. The second most translated and published book in history. John Donne, who wrote the famous poem, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Francis Bacon has more than 70 allusions to the Bible in his essays, and a long list there. But the big guy we need to talk about is William Shakespeare, because you really can't make sense of Shakespeare at all unless you've got a Bible in your hand. So Shakespeare is absolutely saturated with the Bible. In fact, he uses direct biblical phrases hundreds of times. In fact, there's a whole book in which one guy lists 1,604 biblical allusions in his plays. He actually refers to parts of 42 different books in the Bible, with the most coming from Psalms, Genesis, Matthew, and Job. Many of the events in his plays directly mirror their retelling of Bible stories. And he often refers to Bible characters like Herod, Jephthah, Pilate, places like Golgotha, Bashan, and Bible themes like grace and forgiveness and sin and evil are key themes. Shakespeare is just alive with human interest and human drama. And in fact, his theme, sin and forgiveness, that seems to be something that Shakespeare could not get away from. And one of the key places is one of his more famous plays where after killing his father, Macbeth cries out, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" And he's desperately trying to scrub off the blood of his father off his hands. Who of us cannot identify with that deep sense of guilt? We can identify, we've never killed anybody, but all of us would have that sense of, how can I get rid of this guilt? And that's part of why Shakespeare's plays resonate so deeply with readers for these hundreds of years. Well, other writers. Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, two of my favorite books. These are fascinating books that have so many allusions to the Bible in them. William Wordsworth. One guy said his poetry is one long protest against God being banished from this universe. Walter Scott, Jane Austen. Now, every night, my wife and I have a little custom. We read together. So every night, we will read some great classic. So right now, we've read through all of Jane Austen's works more than once together. And right now, we're on Northanger Abbey. Probably the third time we read it together. We've just finished the Chronicles of Narnia. And we'll read other sagas together every night. And then before we do that, we read some from the Bible as well. If you're married, I would suggest that one of the best marriage therapies you can have is to read together. It's a little hard to be really angry at somebody. And now if you're single, I need to warn you that marriage can bring up all the negative emotions that you've ever experienced. A man and woman sometimes just don't gel that well. But it's hard to be angry at somebody when you're laying next to them reading together. So reading Jane Austen. Charles Dickens, one of my favorite authors, he said the New Testament is the very best book that ever was or will be known in the world. And his books are full of these references to Bible events. And of course you have George Eliot. George Eliot was a very immoral woman. Unfortunately, I have to say this, but strangely enough, maybe out of guilt, every one of her books features a church, a priest, a pastor, a preacher. So her characters are never clouded by their Christian faith. She grounds their faith really well. So you have fascinating pictures of faith at work. And you have the Bronte sisters, Charlotte and Emily. You've got Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, which are amazing books. One of my favorite authors when I was a child was, of course, Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island and all the others. And he said that he loved Pilgrim's Progress most, but he had the Bible stood with him in hand. You think about his book, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That whole book is simply a retelling of what Paul describes in Romans 7. The evil nature wrestling with the good nature inside of us. So here's a whole book that's just spelling out what Paul was talking about in Romans 7. Well, even into the 20th century. You've got T.S. Eliot that said the literary influence upon the English language by the Bible is hard to wrestle with. Of course, the most famous was J.R.R. Tolkien, who stood strong in his faith, and his faith is very clear in Lord of the Rings. When I first started traveling across the Soviet Union, as it was back in 1990, I found there were Tolkien clubs scattered all around. Even out in Novosibirsk in Siberia, they told me they had a Tolkien club there, all during the Soviet years. And somehow that underground reading of Christian literature, which is Christian literature at its best, it's retelling the Christian story in a whole mythic world that sometimes gives you new insight into the faith that you grew up with when you see it from the imaginative, creative level of the J.R.R. Tolkien. And of course, Tolkien led his good friend and colleague on the faculty, C.S. Lewis, to know Christ as well. And so C.S. Lewis started this whole different genre, but similar imaginative literature designed for children, but children of all ages. And so when my son and my daughter were young, we read through all the Chronicles of Narnia at least twice, and now my kids are reading to my 5 grandkids Chronicles of Narnia. So it's a way of giving them, stirring their imagination, but doing it with Christian principles all the way through. It's an amazing thing. Well, American literature. Maybe American literature won't stand up quite to the standards of British literature, but it's still impressive. So one guy said, it is impossible to fully appreciate American literature without knowing the King James Bible. Indeed, without knowing almost instinctively the way generations of Americans used to know it. So let me just quickly reel off some American authors who were influenced by the Bible. Washington Irving, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Greenleaf Whittier, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, played a major role in launching the abolition of slavery at the Civil War. 38 of its 45 chapters have references to the Bible, with 100 direct quotations from the Bible in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The famous Herman Melville, Moby Dick. Now, ironically, Melville is quoting the Bible usually in a way to try to attack it, but it's rather strange that people reading Melville often simply see the biblical allusions and kind of miss that Moby Dick was really angry, that Melville was angry at God. Emily Dickinson, Louisa May Alcott. My wife and I read together Little Women a while back, and she kept saying, I want to read that book together. And I said, that sounds like a girl's book. I don't want to read Little Women. But actually, it was Guy's book as well. It was a very interesting book. So you guys don't be embarrassed if you read it sometime. Well, my all-time favorite American author is Willa Cather. And actually, when my wife was teaching linguistics in Lithuania, she made some of these books required for her philology students. If you haven't read Willa Cather, My Antonia and O Pioneers are my 2 favorites. She's written several, but those are 2 of my favorites. And then, of course, you have John Steinbeck. His Grapes of Wrath is really a retelling of the rivalry between Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis. And the theme is, we can choose. We can overcome sin. We are not slaves of fate. That's a very important message in the Bible. Of course, you have Ernest Hemingway, whose own life, he was raised by Christians. His grandparents were Protestant missionaries. He himself went way away from the Christianity of his parents and his grandparents, but he couldn't throw off that evangelical faith that had shaped his family, even though he himself lived a really, let's just say it, a rotten life, and eventually took his own life. Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor, one of the great Catholic American writers of this century. Amazing stories that she spins out. The Bible shaped these writers. Now, maybe you're not getting my message. If these authors were so influenced by the Bible, then wouldn't it be a good idea if you read the book that shaped these writers? I don't want to be too direct, but just so you don't miss the illusion. And of course, great cultural events. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech makes no sense outside of the Bible. He was a pastor. He was a Baptist pastor. And his language, his actions were absolutely shaped by his belief that this book is the Word of God. Well, now let's get more specific. How was the English language shaped by the Bible? Well, I'm going to list 3 ways. Hebrew idioms, and then just generally Bible stories, and then biblical phrases. Okay? So 3 ways, and I'll just give you a few examples. We could do hundreds, but we don't want to be here until 3 o'clock in the morning, okay? I have to catch a flight at 7 in the morning, so I need to stop before then. Okay, first of all, Hebrew idioms that were adopted directly into the English language. I want you to see this. To lick the dust, to fall flat on your face, to pour out one's heart, fly in the ointment, by the skin of my teeth. All these are Hebrew idioms that were just taken directly, translated from Hebrew into English, and then just became an expression that was very common. So my American buddy here would know all those phrases because they're part of the English language. They're native English expressions. So when somebody says, fall flat on your face, it doesn't mean literally they fell down, of course. But, although sometimes I have. But it means that you failed at something, embarrassed yourself. Some of the Bible stories produce phrases. So we talk about the patience of Job, the writing on the wall. Oh boy, something bad. There's writing on the wall. That comes from the story of Daniel, where the hand wrote these 4 words, mene, tekel, upharsin, saying that judgment is coming on the kingdom. In the lion's den, from the same book, where the king got so angry at Daniel for refusing to stop praying that he threw him literally into the lion's den. Harden your heart, what the Pharaoh did when the children of Israel were wanting to flee from Egypt. And to wash your hands of a matter. I think you would understand this one in Ukrainian also, where Pilate washed his hands trying to think, maybe I'll not be guilty of sentencing the Son of God to death. I mean, that's really one of the most stupid things you'll ever read in the Bible. Can you imagine? You've just sentenced an innocent man to death, and you think by putting your hands in some water will clear you? The guy was a total idiot. So that expression is very clear in the English language. Cast the first stone. You remember when these really religious people about this woman and said, we caught her in the act of adultery. Now my question was always, why didn't you bring the man? I mean, after all, if I got my biology right, it takes 2 people, doesn't it, to commit adultery? What happened to the man? But you see Jesus' response. If you're without sin, you cast the first stone. Forbidden fruit from the Garden of Eden. Prodigal son. All these stories gave us expressions that shaped the English language. And then, of course, you have a voice crying in the wilderness. Am I my brother's keeper? As white as snow. This is a very famous expression. In fact, Shakespeare has Hamlet cry out, what if this cursed hand were thicker than itself with brother's blood? Is there not rain enough in the sweet heavens to wash it white as snow? Once again, trying to get rid of the guilt of sin. Of course, one of the famous ones is the simple words, born again. Where Nicodemus, this guy kind of sneaks in the middle of the night and say, hey, Jesus, give me the lowdown on how I can get forgiveness for my sins. And he says, you have to be born again. In other words, you have to have a new start spiritually that only Jesus can give you. You can't give it to yourself. Being born is not something you do yourself. It's something that happens. And so this phrase has become very common, as well as these others. Lamb to the slaughter. This phrase comes from one of the most moving passages of Isaiah. So many of us read it during Holy Week because it recounts. Isaiah was predicting 700 years before the crucifixion what Jesus would endure in detail, what would happen. And he said that he would be led as a lamb to the slaughter. So you can see how the English language is absolutely stamped with these expressions. So let me just, before I try to sum up some of these ideas, let me sum up some of the famous words, some of the most famous words in the Bible. Some of them you may know, some of them may be less familiar. John 3:16 is probably the most famous verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. You notice the simplicity of that language. And that simplicity is how John wrote in Greek as well. So if you take Greek, you will almost always start by studying something that John wrote. It makes it an easy start because his Greek is simple and straightforward. Here's a famous one, the offer that's hard to refuse. And Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." Now that's a reminder. I talked to you earlier that sometimes the friends of the Bible have made it sound boring, and sometimes friends of the Bible have made it sound complicated. Now that makes following Jesus about as simple and uncomplicated as you can get. Other famous words. Psalm 23 is really famous. And when I was a child, the King James, I'm 66 years old, and so the King James was kind of the only Bible our family had. And so much of my brain keeps going back. Even now when I'm reading some of these words, the King James English keeps floating in. But let me read the Psalm 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy shield, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Now, one of the great values of memorizing verses like this is you have them with you. Now, when you get to the ancient age of 66, sometimes you can't sleep quite as well as you could in your early years. And so what I can do is I've got them memorized, so I can simply pull them up. And you see how comforting those words are? And the best part is they're rooted in reality. This book tells us of a real God in a space-time universe who did real actions, and his words can be relied upon. Well, this is one I mentioned yesterday, I believe. Revelation 3:20, because yesterday I talked about serving in an academy, we need a Christian commitment. In Revelation 3:20, Jesus' words, and again, you look at the simplicity of this. And I apologize yesterday because I'm a theologian and a philosopher. You can't get a much worse combination than that. I'm a theologian and a philosopher. If I can't make something complicated, nobody can, okay? We make things complicated. But this is the antidote to being complicated. Jesus saying, listen, I am standing at the door knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come into you and eat with you and you with me. Do you see what I mean? We theologians have made things very complicated, beyond what they should be. One final one. Salvation. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this not of yourselves. It is the gift of God. Not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's masterpiece. The Greek word there is poema. We are God's poem, his work of art, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Now, let me just give a couple of recommendations, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I think the biggest thing I could recommend is to simply try reading this book. It's not as daunting as you might think. Some parts can be very difficult, but I can steer you away from the boring parts, the difficult parts. Wait until later. I read 25 to 50 books a year, I would say, from literature, history, leadership, philosophy. But this is one book I read again and again. It's my favorite book. I know this is an academic lecture, but I've got to confess my bias, or I wouldn't be honest with you. It's had the biggest influence in my life of any book I've ever read. It's the best source of practical wisdom, direction, hope, motivation, guidance, problem solving. So I would recommend it. It's a good book. And actually, in English, it's often called the good book. Many people in America don't even say the Bible, just, do you have the good book? And that's a fair enough way to portray it. So I would say, if you don't read regularly, try the Gospel of Luke. It's fast-moving, lots of action. You see real people being helped, being encountered. And then try the book of Genesis, because you can't get much better on fascinating stories than the book of Genesis. Amazing stories that will grip your attention and give you some ideas about how dysfunctional people can be. Way back then, still dysfunctional, but there's hope and redemption. And then some translations, if you're interested. The Bible Gateway has different translations. The second one there, under Bible translations, the third one, you can get Ukrainian on your phone. If you don't have a Bible on your phone, just so you've got one available, or Bible study resources. Those are just some ideas. Okay, that is my case for reading the Bible, how the Bible has influenced language, and so now we have time for questions. So, who has the first question? Yes.
My English is not very good, but I want to say, what is the version of English Bible is the best, for your opinion?
Okay, that's a great question. What version of the Bible is the best?
Yeah.
Well, the one that I use is called today's New International Version. And the reason I use it is because it uses more, what shall I say, gender-inclusive language. So instead of the old version saying, so brothers, do this, when actually adelphoi is Greek for brothers, literally, but he was talking to everybody in the church. And so today we would say brothers and sisters. It uses brothers and sisters. So it's, I know that's not a big deal, it's not a theological issue necessarily, but it just, I'm more comfortable in our generation that women don't feel like they're always excluded by, nobody ever mentions them outside of those references. So today's New International. But actually, now that I say this, just last week I learned that it's no longer in print, so simply the New International Version. They've incorporated that into their main version.
Thank you.
Yeah. But an easy one to read is also the Living Bible. And it's much more colloquial. And actually I've found some places, because it's more of a paraphrase, but there are places where it's more accurate because it is representing the meaning. So I can read the Greek and then read the English, and the Living Bible is more accurate in some places because it's delivering an equivalency of meaning. So that's just an idea. Okay, second question.
Do you have any recipes to make the difference between, I mean, delineate the difference between secular thinking, non-biblical thinking, and the thinking of people of church that is concentrated on the Bible? But secular citizens are not familiar with this mythological structure and others, and they just grasp that it is very different, very difficult for them, and they say you are crazy just when you talk about Bible. And so.
Well, that's a good question. I think I would have two answers. First of all, I think, as I indicated a little bit earlier, I think sometimes those of us who are friends of the Bible have not helped by making it seem otherworldly. We haven't shown how the Bible speaks to real life. We haven't shown how this book connects with marriage, with politics, with economics. We have tended to think of it, it's only about escaping this world and getting to heaven. Now, the big message of the Bible is God created human beings and they went bad, and we see signs of that badness not only all around us, but when I look in the mirror, I see it. But the good news is Jesus, who is God, became a human being, lived here, died on the cross for our sins, was crucified, and then rose from the dead after 3 days, all to purchase our forgiveness. So in that story, we have an answer to the remedies, to the problems that we're facing as human beings. The problem is, I think many times, it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant, we've made it seem like the Bible is only about our soul. And really the Bible is about not just dying to be with God, but living for Him here. And I think we've neglected. And so yesterday I spoke about a Christian worldview, which is applying principles from the Bible to all of life. And so I think many times it's been those who follow the Bible who have given those who do not believe the Bible the idea but it doesn't really connect with real life. But there's also another issue, and that is, if I'm determined to live the way I want to, and I don't want God telling me, or the church, or anybody else telling me what to do or not to do, then I'm not going to be listening very much to a book that says, God created me, God is the boss, and there will be judgment if I don't change. That's not a very friendly message. And so the church, at the end of the day, the message is not very friendly if people do not want to do the right thing. Because if you tell me, if you don't change, you are going to be judged by a holy and righteous God, and I'm saying, nobody's going to tell me what to do, you can easily say, oh, I don't like the message. So there are many people that say, I don't like the message. But I think the challenge to those of us who do like the Bible and who want to honor God through our lives, our challenge is to make it attractive to people. So we're living with this book in mind. So we're letting Christ shape us. I hope that gets to your question. Okay.
Have you read it only in English or in other languages?
I've read parts of it in Hebrew, and I've read parts of it in Greek, but unfortunately, my language skills are, my modern language skills are primary, and yeah, they're pretty well English. Yeah, I had Latin, but I can do my paternoster, but not much beyond that. So,
do you agree that the Bible is a main book of Western civilization?
I do.
And do you think that there are other religion main books, such as Torah or Quran or some Eastern books deserve the same role? They can be the main books of other world's part of civilization?
That's a good question. I think when you look historically at Western civilization, there's only one book that you could say has been the main book that shaped Western civilization, and that would be the Bible. Now, of course, when you talk about the Torah, then you've got to understand that, you know, we're incorporating, I mean, our Bible is kind of half Jewish and half New Testament, we call it. So half Old Bible, half New Bible. And God, and that's the amazing thing, God blends it together. So I wouldn't want to include that in the conversation. But what you have to realize is other books. I know it's very popular to say, well, all religions really lead to the same place. Well, anybody who's read those books cannot say this. And actually, that's one of the worst insults you can give to people of different religions. Because you're ultimately saying, what your book says doesn't really matter. You're saying the same thing. So if you read about the God of this Bible, that's a very different being than the book that's the God that's described in the Quran. It's very different. So it's really a big insult to Muslims to say, well, we're all saying the same thing. So first of all, we can't say that with intellectual integrity. So the Bible deserves the place that it's got. And that's why actually around the world now we're seeing a huge movement of millions of people recognizing this as God's book. I mentioned yesterday, I lectured a while back in Vietnam for Vietnam National University for the Department of Atheism, and they asked me to lecture on the global expansion of Christianity. And of course, you've got to talk about the Bible when you talk about this. And so what's happening is probably the book that's growing fastest in acceptance around the world is the recognition that this book has answers that all of humankind are looking for. We'll give one or two more questions and then, yes?
You've been talking about that this book first published in 1611 shaped English language. And it sounds to me, you've been reading some passages, it sounds obsolete a little bit. And your point was that to understand a language, you should understand this book, and I suppose in that language of 1611. And my problem is that even Ukrainian language from 200 years ago would sound obsolete to me as well, and maybe it should also, the language should also change in new translations with new language. The point that from Protestant Reformation, that everybody could understand it.
Yes. Okay, excellent point. I'm glad you clarified, because I wouldn't want to leave that dangling. When I'm talking about how the Bible shaped the language, I'm talking primarily about those idioms and expressions. Now, the stories that are referred to in these British and American authors I've been talking about, those transcend the King James translation. Now, some of that will be in, like Herman Melville and others, but they transcend it. So all the phrases I gave you, those are still current in modern American English and actually British English as well for the most part. But you're right. I think it is important for readers to use a modern translation. So actually now for me, when I go back, even though I grew up with the King James Version, when I go back, I find it very difficult to understand, even though many of the words are still in my brain. So that's why I advocate for a modern translation. But the phrases, the idioms, most of those are not the Shakespearean English. They're just straight English words that I showed you. But yeah, it's a good point, because language is constantly changing. And that's why there was controversy over this version, actually, over doing the brothers and sisters expressions instead of just brothers. Because in the past, we were comfortable. We understood that when the Bible said brothers or men, that it was talking about men and women. But it just now makes sense. Why not just say it? Because the word was referring to everyone in the church in those cases. And so it makes sense in our more gender-sensitive world to spell it out. So, good question. One more question? Anybody? Yes?
You have been traveling a lot, and as you mentioned before, people love stories. And my question is about questions. Can you compare different questions from people all around the world? Maybe there are a huge difference between questions from people here in Ukraine and, for example, from people in Vietnam. What surprised you the most?
Okay, good question. Yeah, there are different kinds of questions. Now, I've been to, I guess, 58 countries, and I've lectured in, I don't know how many, not all of those countries, but I've lectured in universities in Muslim countries and, just Asia, and I've lectured at Peking University and China, universities all over China, usually on Christianity, surprisingly, because there's a whole movement in the academy for departments of Christian studies, and I've worked closely with those religion scholars there. So in Asia in particular, I think there are some different kinds of questions, more about a surprise about the size of Christianity and the expanse of Christianity. Whereas in our part of the world here, I lived in Lithuania here next door 5 years, and I've been working in Europe since 1990, all over Central and Eastern Europe and Western. I think our questions are more, how do we apply this? How does this look in this situation? So how do Bible principles apply to sociology or to psychology or to politics? Because we have more of the basic groundwork. We have more of a general understanding. So now we can focus a little bit more on application of the Bible to life, whether on the national scale or the personal scale as well. But there is a difference as well, because most of my lectures are not at a Christian university, and that certainly changes. So for tonight, I felt much freer to not hold the cards close to my chest, so to speak, and not to be so aloof from the subject. So that makes a difference as well, because when you have an audience that you need to convince, like tonight was by far the largest percentage that I've ever had to say they read the Bible, anything in the Bible. And even Lithuania, I've given this lecture in a lecture hall where more than 100 students and professors, and maybe 10 out of 100 would say they'd ever read anything themselves in the Bible. So that would be a little different. So there'd be regional differences as well. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. You're good listeners. Again, if you want the PowerPoint, I can email it to you. But thank you so much for your warm welcome here tonight.
And thank you so much for coming here and for doing such an insightful lecture. And let's